The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Foundation podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Okay, welcome to another interview from Auburn, Alabama, where I'm at the Ludwig von Mises Institute at the Austrian Economists Research Conference. This evening I'm with Tom DiLorenzo, who's a professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Hello, Tom.
Good evening. Pleased to be with you, Andy.
Great stuff. Now, as well as all those things, Tom is also the author of a recent book called Organized Crime, which he spoke about today at the conference. Now, he's better known for you're better known more for your kind of Lincoln books. Can you tell us why you produced this book?
Well, I've been writing. I've been a professor of economics for 32 years, and I've written on a lot of subjects, from antitrust regulation to banking regulation to federal budgeting. I wrote several books earlier in my career on federal budgeting, and I had 55 short articles that had been published somewhere, mostly on the web, but other places that had never really been in print or hadn't been part of a book. So what I did was I rewrote all of them to update them and make them more relevant to today, and I came up with this book, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government, that covers all aspects of government regulation, centralization versus decentralization of power, workers and unions, myths and lies about the free market is one section. So it's 55 short essays in 6 different sections.
Yeah. Now, I would have thought that our Gold Money Foundation listeners would be most interested in section 4, which is on the money and the state. Now, your 30th article in the book, we'll skip over the first 29,
okay,
is on central banking as an engine of corruption. Can you tell us why you think that?
Yes, well, it's taken from one of my academic journal articles that was in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics not too long ago, where the argument that I made was that the very origins of a national bank in America, there's a lot of evidence that it was always intended to be an engine of political corruption. And it's not just that bad men every once in a while get in charge and do bad things. It was intended to be that way. And part of the story that I tell is that when Alexander Hamilton, America's first Treasury Secretary, was in office, one of the things he did was to nationalize the war debt from the American Revolutionary War, which had been incurred by the state governments. And but what he did was to orchestrate a giant arbitrage opportunity whereby the political insiders in Congress and their friends knew that the government was going to buy up these old bonds at face value, at 100% of value, when at the time they were trading between 2 and 10% of value. So there was a massive exodus up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States by the political insiders or their hirees to buy up these war bonds, mostly from old Revolutionary War veterans, at maybe 2% of their value, because they knew they were going to be able to turn around and sell these bonds at 20 times more in a few months. And so Robert Morris, at the time, was known as possibly the richest man in America. The New York Times wrote at the time that he made maybe $6 million on this deal. And so Thomas Jefferson, who was Alexander Hamilton's nemesis, observed all this, and he knew that Hamilton himself was of the opinion that corruption was a necessary ingredient of good government. And so he saw this as a way of corrupting politics, because all the men who he made millionaires in his time would always vote for his economic agenda, no matter what, because he's the man who made them rich. And his economic agenda was the agenda of the nationalists, which was basically to bring British mercantilism to America. They wanted high protectionist tariffs, what we today call corporate welfare, a big public debt, and a bank modeled after the Bank of England. Yeah. And so, but Jefferson figured out also that this scheme would only last so long, because the men who were bribed by the arbitrage scheme would eventually retire or die, and so would their votes. And so Jefferson said a more permanent engine of corruption is needed. And that permanent engine of corruption was the Bank of the United States, which was a precursor of the Fed. And so I make the argument that it always was the intent of a central bank to, among other things, corrupt politics and to be an engine of buying off members of Congress in various ways, not just making them rich, but, for example, funding pork barrel spending projects in their congressional districts that they would be for, and so to get their vote in return for whatever the party in power wanted.
Yeah, so Andrew Jackson managed to get rid of these first initial central banks, but it rose its head again in 1913. Do you think that was... Did they know that they were going to use it as an engine to help fund the World War I, or was that just a coincidence?
I think a lot of the powers that be, the Rockefeller family, the Morgans, the big money people who were also the politically connected in America, they wanted at the time, they not only wanted a central bank, but they wanted the U.S. military to step up its policy of intervening in other countries and sort of forcing mercantilism on other countries, taking over, the sugar industry in the Philippines or someplace like that. And so I don't think they had World War I per se in mind, but I think they did have military interventionism in mind to help fund their financial pursuits. And so the central bank would fulfill that. And I think it was somewhat coincidental that Woodrow Wilson came along and decided that he wanted to turn Europe into a perfect utopia. And of course, the central bank helped him with that.
Yeah, one of the things about the British Empire, the reason the Bank of England was able to help grow that was because of the ability to just print money, wasn't it?
That's certainly true. I quote in my article on corruption as a source or sort of the original motivation for central banking. Alexander Hamilton himself praised the Bank of England to the treetops for all of its what he called his imperial successes in being imperialistic and creating an empire, and he wanted a bank to create an American empire. And of course, in any empire, the citizens, their primary role is to be taxpayers, and their children as cannon fodder. And but if you're on the end of the empire that runs the show, it's a good thing.
Yeah. Now, if we roll forward a bit further, some of the essays you've written in this excellent book are kind of more modern times. Now, from 2008 and so on, we've been in what we might believe is a depression, even though it seems to have been disguised. And that might have been brought on by these government-sponsored enterprises and things like the Community Reinvestment Act. Can you say how you feel about those things? Again, was that a political thing which has led us into depression, or again a coincidence?
Well, I think the Fed is the major cause of the so-called Great Recession. It created the bubble with its pursuit of zero interest rates. But also there were other government institutions in America that lent a helping hand. And I've been writing about these government-sponsored enterprises for many years. My first book was called Underground Government, the Off-Budget Public Sector, published in 1983, where I wrote about Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae, for example. And also I've been writing about the so-called Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 for about 30 years. And what this law did was, under the pretense of bankers supposedly not wanting to make loans to well-qualified minority borrowers. That was the assumption, which never made economic sense to anybody. The government even said that minority bankers, banks owned by minorities, were still discriminating against fellow minorities with good credit ratings, and that never made any sense at all. But what they did is that the government forced banks to make bad loans to unqualified borrowers by the trillions under the so-called Community Reinvestment Act. And for example, one bank in America called Countrywide Bank was given an award by the Federal Reserve Board for having made $600 billion in these loans. And this was about a month or two before Countrywide Bank went bankrupt because of those loans. And so there were many trillions of dollars of these bad loans that were made on purpose. And Congress came into play, and they instructed Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to buy up and securitize these loans. And so the bankers were happy to make bad loans as long as they knew that they could earn a fee by making the loan and then get rid of the risk of the bad loan by selling it immediately to Fannie Mae on the instructions of the U.S. Congress, which they did. And so they would make another fee from Fannie Mae paying them. And that's why part of the big bailout, the so-called TARP bailout, put hundreds of billions of dollars back into Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the other institution, so-called government-sponsored enterprise, to bail out the bailouts involved in this whole rotten system.
Yeah. Now, I want to do two things now. The first thing I want to do is make you president for life with ultimate powers, decision powers, where you'll decide what to do to get us out of this mess. And then once we've figured out the perfect solution, what you think is actually going to happen. So what would you do to get the US and maybe even the rest of the world out of its current financial situation?
I would immediately bring all the troops home from overseas and eliminate the defense budget by about 90%. I would eliminate the income tax and replace it with nothing at all. And I would phase out the welfare state within 3 years. The state of Michigan did this and by cracking down on welfare recipients, telling them if you're able-bodied and you're not mentally disabled or physically disabled and you're on welfare, you have to do some kind of work. We will find some kind of work for you to do, whether it's shoveling snow or picking up litter in a public park. We will find work for you to do. And within a couple of months, the welfare rolls in the state of Michigan dropped, I believe the number was by 80%. And so the gig was up. The people who were simply collecting checks when they knew that they could have well been working knew the gig was up, and they went back to work. And so I think that's what happened nationwide. If we simply announced, if you're able-bodied and of sound mind, you need to find a job, and we will help you find a job, but you need to work. It's no more free lunch. And so those are the first couple of things I would do. Okay,
so that might be a little bit fanciful for us to imagine. Well, we can imagine it, but what do you think's actually going to happen in Mr. Obama's second term?
Well, Obama has been all about exploding government spending. He's been bold enough to propose eye-popping increases in government expenditures, even bigger than George Bush, who was the all-time big spender, even bigger than Lyndon Johnson was on domestic policy, not the wars, but domestic policy. And so Obama knows that the only way out of that is more and more taxes and more government control, more and more debt, and more enslavement to the state. And so he wants us to move full bore in the direction of socialism. He's been a lifelong socialist, after all. My friend Yuri Maltsev, who once worked for Mikhail Gorbachev and who's now an American economist, calls Obama the proud Marxist in the White House. And as someone who once worked for the general head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, he knows a Marxist when he sees one. And so I think that's the direction he would like to see us go. And that doesn't mean that's the direction we will go in, because there was a famous incident you may recall when Bill Clinton was president, and he was asking his Treasury Secretary about what would happen if he raised taxes significantly. And Robert Rubin, the Treasury Secretary, said the bond market will tank and will hurt your prospects for re-election. So Bill Clinton dropped that idea like a hot potato. But Obama is now a lame duck, and so he doesn't care about the bond market or any other market. So he's a very dangerous man right now. But we shall see. I can't forecast.
Where do you see money going in the United States? Do you think there'll be a hyperinflation, or will it just be a kind of Japanese-style grumbling along for 20 years situation?
Well, who knows? I think we certainly seem to be heading in the Japanese direction right now. And fortunately for us, so many dollars have gone overseas, and we've exported a lot of our inflation. But when they start coming back, that'll create some inflation. And then if the Fed stops paying banks for just holding on to excess reserves, and they start lending more than they are now, that'll boost prices up also, because there are a lot of excess reserves out there, as you know, and it's sort of a ticking time bomb. And so I'd hate to think that we were, when we had 17, 18, 20% mortgage interest rates in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was nearly a revolution in America over that. And so the people finally did wake up. And so I think we do have a history the what H.L. Mencken, the American pundit, once called the bourgeoisie. There is a history of the bourgeoisie waking up and forcing the government to just stop it.
Do you think that if that should happen, and maybe there'll be a kind of Mississippi bubble moment where the whole thing will just implode in a few days or hours even, do you think there's any chance of moving towards a gold-backed or even a fully gold-backed kind of money?
I think there is a chance, but I think the way in which it would happen sometime in the future is if there is a secession movement in America and we're broken up in maybe 7, 8, or 10 different republics, like in the same fashion that the Soviet Union broke up, and we might have our Estonia, which was relatively more free market, libertarian oriented than the rest of the former Soviet republics, and that's where you would see a demonstration project for a gold standard. But if that happened, they would become more prosperous and more free almost immediately than anybody else. And I think that would put a tremendous pressure on the other republics that had seceded to follow suit and do the same. So that my sort of prediction would be, if this happened, someday, maybe 50 years from now, you would see 10 or 12 different republics, most of which are on the gold standard, because of this demonstration project that could very well work.
Well, let's hope we do move towards some kind of gold money. It's been great speaking to you today, Tom, and I'm looking forward to seeing you speaking in the next few days.
Thanks for having me.
Subscribe to the Gold Money newsletter at www.goldmoney.com to receive email updates on new articles, videos, and iTunes podcasts from our gold research section.
Now, as well as all those things, Tom is also the author of a recent book called Organised Crime, which he spoke about today at the conference. Now, he's better known you're better known more for your kind of Lincoln books. Can you tell us why you produced this book?
Well, I've been writing. I've been a professor of economics.
The information contained in this podcast is an expression of opinion and does not constitute investment advice. This is the Gold Money Foundation podcast with Andy Duncan, keeping you up to date with expert opinion on precious metals and the markets.
Okay, welcome to another interview from Auburn.
Mostly on the web, but other places that had never really been in print or hadn't been part of a book. So what I did was I rewrote all of them to update them and make them more relevant to today. And I came up with this book, Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government, that covers all aspects.
Alabama, where I'm at the Ludwig von Mises Institute at the Austrian Economists Research Conference. This evening I'm with Tom DiLorenzo, who's a professor of economics at Loyola University, Maryland, and a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Hello, Tom.
Good evening. Pleased to be with you, Andy.
Great stuff.
For 32 years, and I've written on a lot of subjects, from antitrust regulation to banking regulation to federal budgeting. I wrote several books earlier in my career on federal budgeting, and I had 55 short articles that had been published somewhere, most